And since God alone possesses these fundamental features of the family from all eternity, and in their perfection, God is more of a family than the Hahns or the Millers or the Smiths. It would be more accurate to say, from the Pope's perspective, that the Hahns are sort of like a family because we possess fatherhood, sonship. I've got 6 kids, an interpersonal love. Kimberly embodies that, but only imperfectly, to a finite and limited extent. But God possesses these essential attributes of the family in their perfection from all eternity. He isn't like a father. He is an eternal Father. And the Holy Father goes on to explain how from all eternity, Father is not just a noun but a verb. Because God is a Father, an eternal Father, He is eternally fathering. So it's not just a noun, a verb, it's an action. What does it mean for God to be eternally fathering? It means that Jesus, the Son, isn't younger than the Father. He isn't smaller than the Father. He is co-eternal with the Father. If God is eternally fathering, then the eternal result is an eternal Son. Because He's God from God, light from light, true God from true God, because He's not made like we are. He is begotten, not made, from all eternity. Even more than being creator, God is a Father, because creation isn't eternal, but God is as Father and Son, and for Him to father means taking His life and not lording it over His Son, but making His life a gift of love and lavishing it on His Son. So that fathering is the dynamism of love, life-giving love. So if the Son is the image of the Father, He has to image the Father as dynamically as the Father fathers the Son. And John Paul says that is why the Son not only receives the gift of love from the Father, but He loves the Father by returning that life as a gift of His own love. And who do we call that life, that gift, that love? The Holy Spirit, coming from the Father to the Son and from the Son to the Father. When I was done with this, I'm thinking, wow, for Him this is more than doctrine. This is more than a defined dogma. This is a spiritual vision and a practical challenge that He was issuing not only to the Catholics, but I found myself as a Protestant challenged to revisit a doctrine that I said I believed, but I'd never really pondered. And the more I did, the more I wondered, how in the world does He expect ordinary Catholics or Christians to do this? I mean, does He expect believers to become professional theologians? No, not at all. You don't have to become a professional car mechanic, though, in order to get your driver's license. And so He was just saying, learn to love the one you worship by getting to know God better. And that made sense to me because true love leads you to long to get to know the ways of your beloved even more. And so for us, we should not only be asking things from God and thanking Him for what we receive, we should be longing to get to know God better for who He is. The fact of the matter is, speaking as a professional, theology is not our monopoly. Theology is not the exclusive domain of professional theologians. There's a true sense in which theology is for all believers. Jesus Himself says in Matthew chapter 22:37, "You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all of your mind and strength." That's really all we mean by theology, is coming to know God more, coming to love Him better by using our minds, not just our feelings and our bodies. Okay, what difference does that make, though, for someone who's going to try to really get to know God the way John Paul and Benedict have asked Catholics? Well, it struck me back then, and it still hits me today, that it's easy to fall into a habit of relating to other people simply in terms of what they can do for you. I know from experience to expect that from my students, or clerks in stores expect it from customers. But we also know from experience that there's no friendship possible unless the other person gets beyond what I can do for them and they get to know me for who I really am. Well, the same thing is true for God. It's one thing to thank God for what He's done in making us and in saving us through Christ. But God is our Creator, Redeemer, and Sanctifier in time. That's what He does. From all eternity, God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That alone captures who He is. So it's right to give Him thanks for what He's done, but it's even better to give Him praise for who He is. That's why we say it is right to give Him thanks and praise. But thanksgiving is a good form of worship, but lower than praising God for who He is. This is the way worship leads us into a deeper relationship with the living God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Now, I can think back to an experience I had years ago. In the early 90s, I began holding weekly Bible studies in my home. And we would end up with like 70 or 80 people crowded into our living room. And one night, my two oldest at the time, they were like 13 and 11. They came downstairs, and I noticed as I was getting started that they weren't going to bed. They were sitting up on the steps. And so before I began, I motioned them, get to bed. And my 13-year-old said, "But Dad, can't we do Bible study?" Yeah, and all the students were kind of like, they knew exactly what he was up to. And so, I caved as a father. What can I say? I went ahead and let him have my way. I said, "Sure, but only if you really pay attention." And so Michael and Gabe were like, "We will, So, if paying attention is the price you pay to stay up late past your bedtime, they paid attention for an entire hour of a Bible study, or at least they acted really well, pretended. At the end of it, we had Q&A. A couple of whiz kid grad students, "Professor Hahn, can you explain the theology of the decree concerning the Immaculate Conception from the Franciscan standpoint, from the Scotist and Dominican?" And these guys, their eyes are drooping, they're rolling their eyes, they couldn't even understand the question. I could see my kids nodding off. So I answered it quickly, then another question. "Dr. Hahn, can you explain the metaphysic behind this eternal decree from the divine being through Mary?" So I did my best, and at this point they were like, was that English? Some of my undergraduates were wondering too. Well, it was late, it was about 10 p.m. at that point, so I let them all out. They left that night, and I'm looking at all these folding chairs when suddenly a voice comes from upstairs. "Dad, could we stay up a little later to help you put the chairs away?" Once again, I let them have my way. "Sure, take 5-10 more minutes." So as they came down, they got the sweeper out, they were folding up the chairs. Suddenly, my son turned to me and goes, "Professor Hahn, could you explain the theology of the folding chair?" And then my other son, with the Hoover, he said, "And Dr. Hahn, could you explain the metaphysic of the vacuum sweeper?" I'm like, "Cut, guys." I said, "Doctor is what I do, Dad is who I am, and don't you ever forget that." And even my students know the difference between what I do and who I am. And you can't really understand what somebody does unless you trace it back to who they are in real life. And that isn't just true in our human experience, it's also true in our relationship with the living God. We've got to get beyond what He does, and we've got to get to know God for who He really is in His deepest mystery. I think this hit me even harder. About a year later, I was out in the Midwest giving some talks for adult education. And I attended a Mass early in the morning on Sunday. And as it began, I noticed that behind the altar stood the priest and this woman, religious, and she began, instead of the priest, she goes, "We begin in the name of the Creator, the Redeemer, and the Sanctifier," while making the sign of the cross. And I wasn't sure exactly why, but I felt unsettled in my own heart. And so I nodded, I bowed my head, and I was praying, "God, what's wrong with this?" Apart from liturgical norms and feminist motives, I just felt a disturbance. And suddenly it occurred to me, we were no longer calling upon God in terms of who God is as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We were simply identifying Him in terms of what He's done in creating, redeeming, and sanctifying us. And, it might seem to you like quibbling, but it struck me at the time that, no matter how old you think the world might be, whether it's hundreds of thousands or tens of millions or billions and billions of years, like, Carl